I want to talk about something that I think most people who consider themselves knowledgeable about the First World War have completely backwards. The image we have of the German soldier looking across no man's land at his British opponent, the image shaped by a century of British war memory, by Blackadder and Wilfred Owen and the Lions led by Donkey's narrative, is an image of two sides locked in mutual hatred and mutual contempt, with incompetent British commanders throwing brave men at efficient German defences. It is an image of the British soldier as victim and the German soldier as machine. I was reading a book a few months ago, Christopher Duffy's Through German Eyes, The British and the Somme 1916, which is built almost entirely from German intelligence reports, interrogation records, and internal military assessments that sat in the Bavarian war archives for decades before anyone translated them. And what those documents show is so different from the standard picture that I had to stop several times and reread passages to make sure I was understanding them correctly. The Germans, in their own internal documents written for German military audiences, with no reason to flatter the enemy, described the British army with increasing respect throughout the war. They were impressed by British coordination. They were disturbed by British morale. And one German intelligence officer noted, after interrogating hundreds of British prisoners at the Somme, that every single one of them still believed Britain was going to win the war, and that this was the first real indication German intelligence had received that the war might ultimately be lost. That is not the story we usually tell about the British soldier on the Western Front, but it is what the Germans thought, and it is documented, and it is extraordinary. This video is about what German soldiers really thought of the British, and I want to warn you up front that the answer is considerably more complicated, considerably more human, and in some ways considerably more surprising than anything the standard history gives you. German soldiers writing home about the British, and it's not what you'd expect. There's this odd respect running through a lot of it, grudging sometimes, but real. This idea that whatever else was going on, the man across the wire knew what he was doing. Which is a decent way into today's sponsor, actually, Medal Hunter, because that's kind of the whole game, respecting the other side, enough to actually time your shot right instead of just hoping. This video's sponsored by them, just to be upfront. No auto-aim, it's all about timing, waiting for the right moment to take your shot. You're stuck holding a wave, and it's one shot to make it count. It's 3-wave PvP, and instead of running around spraying bullets, you're on a stationary weapon, flak, artillery, sniper, and you're just waiting. The locations are actually great as well: Pearl Harbor, Warsaw, Vietnam, Afghanistan, real operations. And obviously I like realism, so that's a big plus for me. As you win, you build up your haven, you collect gunner cards, you climb the leagues. And it's not really about who shoots first, it's about who aims better and plans smarter. Look, I don't shill games, I don't play, I played this one. Go download Medal Hunter, links in the description, use code Storm of Steel, and you'll get 5 gunner commanders, the most powerful in the game, for free. Same code's pinned in the comments, so you don't have to scrub back for it. Go check it out, seriously. Because it involves professional respect, genuine human connection, a fascinating internal division within the German army itself, and a specific terror of one particular group of British soldiers that the Germans expressed in language that I find genuinely remarkable. Let me start with the man whose account of facing the British is the most detailed and the most honest that any German soldier of the First World War produced. His name was Ernst Junger. He was a lieutenant in the 73rd Hanoverian Infantry Regiment, one of the most decorated German soldiers of the entire war. He was wounded 14 times and received the Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest military decoration. He spent most of the war on the Western Front, facing British troops. And after the war, he wrote a memoir called Storm of Steel, which is one of the most extraordinary documents the First World War produced on any side. What Junger writes about the British is not what you would expect from a man who spent 4 years trying to kill them and being nearly killed by them in return. He wrote, "It has always been my ideal in war to eliminate all feelings of hatred and to treat my enemy as an enemy only in battle, and to honour him as a man according to his courage. It is exactly in this that I have found many kindred souls among British officers, and later. Throughout the war, it was always my endeavour to view my opponent without animus, and to form an opinion of him as a man on the basis of the courage he showed. I would always try and seek him out in combat and kill him, and I expected nothing else from him. But never did I entertain mean thoughts of him. When prisoners fell into my hands later on, I felt responsible for their safety, and would always do everything in my power for them. This is not a man describing an enemy he despised. This is a man describing an enemy he respected, with the specific quality of respect that comes from facing someone across no man's land for 4 years, and understanding what they were capable of. I want to give you more of Junger's account of facing the British, because it is in the specific moments he describes, the individual encounters, the specific observations, that the picture of what the German soldiers experience becomes real rather than abstract. He describes an incident during the Christmas truce of 1914 in his own sector, though he tells it with the detachment of a man reporting a strange event rather than celebrating it. The men on both sides had come out of their trenches. There was lively traffic and exchange going on in schnapps, cigarettes, uniform buttons in front of the wire. The crowds of khaki-coloured figures that streamed from the hitherto so deserted English trenches had a most bewildering effect. Suddenly, there was a shot that dropped one of his fellows dead in the mud, whereupon both sides disappeared like moles into their trenches. The truce ended. It ended with one shot, from what source and for what reason nobody knew, and both sides went back underground. It is a brutally honest account of how these things worked, the fragility of the human connection, the ease with which it could be broken, the speed with which men who had been standing within arm's reach of each other could vanish back into their roles. What Junger consistently returns to in his descriptions of the British is their professional quality under fire. He does not romanticize them. His assessment is military, technical, grounded in what he observed under combat conditions. The British soldier in his account was capable of absorbing punishment at a level that he found remarkable. Not courage in the heroic sense. Junger was too honest a writer to use that kind of language about what he had seen, but a specific quality of endurance and forward momentum that the German infantry found consistently difficult to stop. Men who kept coming even after they should, by any rational calculation, have stopped. And his specific account of what the British brought to the Western Front is one that I think most people who know the war from the British side would find startling, because Junger does not describe the British artillery the way the British cultural memory describes it, as a blunt instrument that killed as many of his own men as the enemy. He describes it as something genuinely terrifying. He calls it a devouring monster serviced by indefatigable demons. When he writes about the moment in March 1918 when the German spring offensive finally silenced the British guns, when the artillery that had been the constant backdrop of 4 years of fighting finally went quiet, he describes a cheer going up along the entire German front line, not a cheer of triumph over a defeated enemy, a cheer of sheer relief that the thing they had been living with and dying from for 4 years had finally stopped. The British guns were, for the German infantry facing them, the primary enemy, not the men, the guns. This matters because it complicates the picture. The British soldier who went over the top at the Somme in 1916 and was cut down by German machine guns is the image we remember. But on the other side of no man's land, the German soldier crouching in his position while the British artillery worked over his trench was equally terrified and equally destroyed and equally the victim of a system that was grinding both sides simultaneously. Junger understood this. Most of the German soldiers I have read about understood it. The men in the opposite trenches were not abstractions. They were men doing the same thing you were doing for the same reasons you were doing it, and they were as likely to die as you were. And this fact, which the official narrative of both sides worked hard to obscure, was visible and unavoidable to anyone who was actually there. Christopher Duffy's research establishes what German military intelligence thought of the British Army at an institutional level, and it is genuinely illuminating. The Bavarian War Archives contain the internal reports that German commanders sent to each other during and after the Somme campaign, reports written for German military audiences with no reason whatsoever to be kind to the enemy. These reports describe what the Germans actually observed and actually feared. What they observed was a volunteer army, the Kitchener Army, the men who had responded to the famous recruiting poster and signed up in the first years of the war, that was performing better than the German command had expected. The reports describe British equipment, tactics, and fighting prowess as in several cases better than German equivalents. They describe the British ability to coordinate artillery, aircraft, and infantry as impressive and increasingly sophisticated. They describe the weight of British artillery fire as one of the primary factors demoralising German defenders. Not the British infantry coming forward, but the guns that preceded them. And then there is the morale question. Every British prisoner interrogated by German intelligence during the Somme, according to Duffy's research, still believed Britain was going to win the war. Every single one. They gave name, rank, and number, and very little else. The Germans found them uncommunicative, unhelpful, frustrating to interrogate. But the one thing that came through consistently was an unbroken belief in the eventual outcome. British soldiers who had been through weeks of the Somme, who had seen what the battle was costing, who were prisoners of the enemy, they still believed they were going to win. And a German intelligence officer noted, with what sounds in the documents like genuine unease, that this specific quality of morale was the first clear indication that the German High Command had received that the war would ultimately be lost. That is the German assessment of the British soldier at the Somme, not lions led by donkeys, a formidable, resilient, increasingly professional army whose morale could not be broken even by one of the most expensive battles in the history of warfare. Now, I want to take you to something that most accounts of the First World War mention, but almost none of them explain properly. The Christmas truce of December 1914 is one of the most extraordinary events of the war, and it has been so thoroughly mythologized, the football matches, the carols, the moment of humanity in the middle of catastrophe, that the specific and genuinely remarkable details of what actually happened have been buried under the sentimentality. The first specific detail, the truce, was not universal. This is important. On sections of the Western Front, where Prussian regiments held the German line, there was no truce. In some cases, men who tried to fraternize were shot. On December 25, 1914, when the truce was at its height in some sectors, almost 100 British soldiers still died on the Western Front. The image of the war stopping for Christmas is a myth. What happened was something more specific and more interesting than that. The truce was most common, most extensive, and most human where one particular type of German regiment faced British troops, the Saxon regiments. Saxony was one of the German states, not Prussia, not Bavaria, but Saxony. And the Saxon soldiers brought to the Western Front a specific attitude to the British that the Prussian soldiers did not share. The Saxons felt a genuine ethnic and cultural kinship with the British, Anglo-Saxon. The name itself was the connection. These were men who understood themselves, at some level, as related to the people they were fighting. The documented accounts of this specific Saxon-British connection are some of the most extraordinary primary sources of the entire war. A Saxon officer meeting a British captain of the North Staffordshire Regiment, arranging the end of a truce formally, saluting and bowing before he returned to his trench, said, "We are Saxons, you are Anglo-Saxons. Word of a gentleman is for us as for you." Another Saxon soldier, speaking to British troops across the wire, said, "We are Saxons, you are Anglo-Saxons, what is there for us to fight about?" I find this sentence genuinely moving every time I read it. Two men on opposite sides of a war that will kill millions of people, one of them saying to the other, "What is there for us to fight about?" And the answer, which neither of them could have given at that moment, was nothing that they had chosen. Everything that had been decided for them. The Saxons floated friendly messages in bottles down streams that ran through both sets of trenches. They called out in English. Many of them had worked in Britain before the war, in London and Manchester, as hotel staff and barbers and musicians, and they spoke the language with the specific quality that comes from having actually lived somewhere. Archibald Stanley, a British soldier who took part in the 1914 truce, described what it was like. "We met in no man's land on Christmas Day. We shook hands, they were Saxons, and I heard one fellow talking English. I said to him, 'You speak English?' You know what he said? 'Cor blimey mate,' he said. 'I was in a London hotel when the war broke out.'" I thought that topped it. He'd got the London accent. A German soldier in the trenches opposite British lines, speaking English with a London accent, because 6 months ago he had been working in a London hotel. This is the specific human reality of a war that official narratives on both sides were trying to make into a contest between civilizations, between good and evil, between the free world and Prussian militarism. The man in the opposite trench had been your neighbour. He had served you coffee, he had cut your hair, he spoke your language with your accent, and now he was shooting at you, and you were shooting at him, and on Christmas Day 1914 you met in the space between, and shook hands, and he said, "Cor blimey mate," because that was the English he had learned in the hotel where we used to work. Some of the meetings during the truce produced moments of dark comedy that I think capture the specific absurdity of the situation better than any serious analysis. One British unit and the German unit opposite them established during the truce an informal agreement. If either side received an order to attack, they would warn the other side in advance so the men could take cover. The British soldier who recorded this in his diary noted, "General HQ would be pretty sick if they knew this," which is the understatement of the entire war. Now, the internal division within the German army, because this is one of the most underappreciated aspects of the story, and it explains why the German attitude to the British was so varied. The German army in the First World War was not monolithic. It was composed of soldiers from multiple German states, Prussia, Bavaria, Saxony, Württemberg, Baden, and others, each with their own military tradition, their own regional culture, and their own specific attitude to the war and to the enemy. And the difference between these groups in terms of their attitude to the British was enormous. The Prussian soldier, aggressive, militaristic, driven by a specific Prussian military culture that regarded the war as a test of national will, and any softening of combat attitude as a form of treachery. Prussian units did not fraternize. Prussian units actively disrupted truces in adjacent sectors. Prussian officers were the ones issuing orders that soldiers found in British-held trenches after raids, orders forbidding fraternization, describing it as high treason, threatening execution. The Saxon soldier, as I have described, a specific kinship with the British, a willingness to live and let live. The men who put Christmas trees on the parapet and sang Silent Night and met in no man's land to shake hands and exchange cigarettes. And then the Bavarian soldier, whose attitude to the British was shaped by something even more surprising. Benjamin Siemens' research on Bavarian peasant soldiers, men from rural Bavaria, farmers and craftsmen who had been mobilized and sent to the Western Front, shows that these men had almost no desire to fight anyone. Their primary motivation was survival and return to their farms. Their xenophobic feelings were, if anything, more likely to be directed at the Prussians running the German war effort than at the British or French enemy. Fights between Prussian and Bavarian units at the front were not uncommon. Some of the most striking documents of Bavarian soldier experience describe the Prussians in terms that would have been appropriate for an enemy force. This internal tension within the German army, the Prussian military tradition trying to impose its will on Bavarian farmers who wanted to go home, and Saxon soldiers who felt culturally connected to the men they were supposed to be killing, produced this tacit system of mutual restraint that became one of the defining features of the Western Front in its quieter sectors. Tony Ashworth's research on trench warfare in the First World War documented this system in extraordinary detail, and what he found is one of the most remarkable pieces of social history of the war. In the quiet sectors of the Western Front and the sectors away from the major offensives where regiments would rotate through after being bloodied in the battles and before being sent back, both sides would develop informal agreements not to fight each other too hard. The agreements were never written down, they were never formally acknowledged, but they were real, they were systematic, and they involved complex social mechanisms for maintaining them. The ritual of the morning artillery bombardment is one example. In active sectors, German artillery would fire on British trenches and British artillery would fire on German trenches and men would die. In quiet sectors, both sides had learned to fire at specific times at specific places in ways that were predictable, so that both sides could take cover before the shells arrived. The artillery was firing, the shells were landing, but the men knew when to duck and where to be. The bombardment was ritual, it was theatre. It served the purpose of satisfying the observation aircraft and the staff officers that the war was still being conducted. It killed almost nobody. During mealtimes, both sides would often observe an informal ceasefire. A British soldier whose account Ashworth cites observed that it is only common courtesy not to interrupt each other's meals with intermittent missiles of hate. The German soldier opposite him apparently agreed. Working parties between the lines, men repairing wire, men carrying supplies, men doing the maintenance work that kept both sets of trenches functional, were often unmolested by mutual agreement. A British soldier could walk openly above his trench in a quiet sector. A German soldier frying sausages in the open in a quiet sector did not attract fire, because both sides understood that the smoke from the fire was visible, and the implied agreement was that neither side would use it as a target indicator. This informal arrangement was fragile. One aggressive act, one raid, one officer newly arrived from the base with different ideas about how the war should be fought could break it instantly. And the high command on both sides was aware of it and actively working to destroy it. The German order of 29 December 1914 forbade fraternization as high treason. General Smith-Dorrien, on the British side, issued an order on January 1st which still required court-martial for officers or NCOs who allowed fraternization. Neither order was very effective in the short term, but over the course of the war, the combination of command pressure, the replacement of the men who had made the original agreements, and the sheer accumulation of loss and bitterness that the war produced gradually eroded the system in the most active sectors. What is remarkable is how long it persisted in the quieter ones. Tony Ashworth documents cases of live and let live that continued into 1917 and 1918 in sectors of the front that had been left alone by the major offensives. Men rotating into these sectors would inherit the truce the way they inherited the specific geography of the trenches, as something that existed before them and that they were expected to maintain until further notice. The Germans opposite would signal, through established rituals, whether the new arrivals were expected to continue the equilibrium or whether things were changing, and often the new arrivals chose to continue it, because the alternative was to start a fight that neither side could win in that sector, and that would cost both sides men who would otherwise survive. One documented British account describes the specific moment when a quiet sector ended. A new British regiment rotated into a sector that had been in live and let live equilibrium. The German regiment opposite sent them a note: "Please do not shoot, we do not intend to shoot." But the new regiment had come from an active sector and had different habits, and within 24 hours the shooting had resumed and the equilibrium was gone. The men who had been there before them had maintained something precarious and specific and human, and it had ended not because of orders from above but because of the specific character of the men who replaced them. There is one more dimension I want to give you before I move to the pre-war connections, and it is the gap between German official narrative about the British and what German soldiers actually thought. The official German position on the British enemy was clear. Britain was perfidious Albion, treacherous mercenary, fighting not for noble ideals but for commercial advantage and imperial self-interest. Britain had entered the war to preserve its empire and its global trade position, not for any principle. The British soldier was not a patriot but a mercenary, fighting for money in a war he did not genuinely believe in. This was the message that German soldiers were told, and it was the image of the British that German newspapers promoted and German politicians endorsed. The German soldiers who actually faced the British army dismissed this almost entirely. The specific quality that German intelligence reports noted repeatedly, that British prisoners, even after the Somme, even after weeks of the worst fighting of the war, still believed Britain was going to win, was precisely the quality that the German narrative said British soldiers lacked. These were not mercenaries with no stake in the outcome. They were men who believed they were fighting for something, and who maintained that belief under conditions that would have broken most convictions. He is explicit about this gap between official narrative and reality. Junger describes the British soldiers he faced with a specific quality of professional acknowledgement that has nothing to do with the official German position on what those soldiers represented. He is not describing mercenaries, he is describing men whose courage he respected and whose tenacity he found genuinely challenging. The German officer who said to a British captain that "word of a gentleman is for us as for you" was not speaking to a mercenary. He was speaking to a man he recognised as an equal. This gap between what German soldiers were told to think about the British and what they actually thought is one of the recurring features of the German documentation of the war, and it mirrors the gap on the British side between what British soldiers were told to think about the Germans and what they actually found when they met them. Both sides were fighting men who, once encountered directly, were recognisably human in ways that the official narratives of both countries worked very hard to deny. Before the Australian and Canadian dimension, I want to give you the specific terror, because not all of the German attitude to the British was respect or human connection or the complex sociology of the informal truces. Some of it was genuine, documented fear, and the objects of that fear were a specific group of British soldiers whom the German army regarded with a combination of dread and something close to superstitious awe. The Scottish regiments, the German Imperial Army declared the Black Watch, the 3rd Battalion of the Royal Regiment of Scotland, descended from the regiment raised in the Scottish Highlands in the 18th century, to be the regiment most to be feared on the entire Western Front. Not the most professional, not the most skilled, most to be feared. The language is specific, and it is interesting. The kilted Scottish soldiers acquired from German troops a nickname that has passed into historical record, and that I think captures the quality of the fear precisely. Die Damen aus der Hölle, the ladies from hell. German soldiers called kilted Scottish troops the ladies from hell, and the name was not affectionate. the kilts, which struck German soldiers as bizarre, as incomprehensible, as wrong in ways that were hard to articulate. Combined with the specific quality of the Scottish approach to combat to produce in the opposing German infantry a reaction that military historian Matthew Lowe, who found German propaganda postcards depicting Scottish soldiers as the primary threat among the Allied forces, described as the German army demonising Scottish soldiers as savage barbarians. A German propaganda postcard distributed in occupied Belgium and France depicted the opponents of the German Empire. It included Russians, Frenchmen, Africans, Sikhs, Indians, and most prominently in the foreground, more prominent than any other figure, was a kilted Highland soldier. The Germans were using the Scots as the face of what they were fighting against, not the English soldier, not the French poilu, not even the terrifying Australians who were beginning to make their presence felt by 1916 and 1917. The kilted Highlander. The bagpipes were specifically terrifying. German accounts describe what happened when Scottish regiments went over the top with pipers at the front, which they did throughout the war, pipers walking into the open, while everyone else was trying to stay as low as possible. The sound of the bagpipes coming over no man's land was, according to German soldier accounts, one of the most psychologically disturbing things they experienced, and when a piper was shot down, another would rise to take his place, because the role of the piper was not optional. It was understood by the Scottish soldiers themselves as essential to the attack, and the pipers accepted the specific additional danger their position entailed. The Germans could not stop the bagpipes. You could shoot the piper, another piper would come, and the sound would continue. The data on Scottish casualties tells you something about the specific quality of what the Scottish regiments brought to the Western Front and what it cost them. Over 26% of Scottish servicemen died in the First World War. The UK average was 11%. Scottish soldiers died at more than twice the rate of the average British serviceman, which tells you something about how hard they were used, how far forward they were placed, and how completely they were committed to the fighting. The fear of the Scottish regiments was not irrational. It was a response to something real. The German soldiers who encountered the Black Watch or the Gordon Highlanders or the Cameron Highlanders in a raid or an assault were encountering men who had been fighting in Scottish wars for generations, who came from a military culture that was specific and old and different from the culture of the English infantry battalions, and who brought to the trenches of Flanders a quality of ferocity that the German soldiers on the other side of the wire found genuinely disturbing. The ladies from hell. Not ladies. Not from hell. But close enough to earn the name. Before I give you the pre-war connections, I want to give you the colonial dimension, the Australians and Canadians, because German soldiers drew a very specific distinction between British soldiers and the soldiers who came from the British Empire's settler colonies, and that distinction tells you something important about what they were experiencing. The Australian Imperial Force arrived on the Western Front in 1916, after Gallipoli, and within months had established a reputation that German soldiers recorded in their diaries and letters home in terms that are genuinely striking. A German soldier account from the New South Wales State Archives describes what faced his regiment when Australians arrived in their sector. We have not yet met with any German regiment which could stand up to the Australians. Wherever the Tommies meet with the reverse, the colonial troops are called upon to make it good, and as yet, they have always succeeded in doing so. This is a German soldier writing about the Australian soldiers he was fighting, and the assessment is unambiguous. The Australians were categorically different from anything the German army had encountered. Not just better, different in kind. What made the Australians different in German accounts was a specific combination of qualities. They were aggressive in a way that the British infantry by 1916 had been somewhat trained out of. They raided constantly. They attacked at unexpected times and from unexpected directions. They took no notice of conventions that German and British soldiers had developed in the quiet sectors, the informal mealtimes, the unspoken boundaries. A sector that had been quiet for months would become intensely dangerous the moment Australians moved in. German units that had been in comfortable equilibrium with British infantry would suddenly be in constant aggressive combat. The Canadians produced a similar reaction. By 1917 and 1918, German intelligence reports described Canadian units as shock troops, the term Stoßtruppen that the Germans had developed for their own assault infantry, applied to the enemy. Canadian soldiers who attacked with grenades and bayonets in the dark, who captured positions that German commanders had believed were impregnable. The specific reputation of Canadian forces in the German army was so well established that by late 1917, German commanders would identify which Canadian unit they were facing and draw conclusions about the level of threat they should anticipate. The distinction German soldiers drew between the British infantry and the Australian and Canadian infantry is illuminating precisely because it was not a simple hierarchy of quality. It was a recognition that these were different kinds of soldiers shaped by different experiences and different cultures. The British Tommy, by 1916, had been trained into a specific kind of disciplined, controlled infantry combat that the German military could understand and predict. The Australian and Canadian soldiers had been shaped by different histories and different relationships to authority, and they brought to the Western Front a quality that the German army found genuinely difficult to categorise. Now I want to give you the specific pre-war connection between Germany and Britain, because it is one of the most extraordinary aspects of the story, and it almost entirely disappears from the general history. Before the war, London and Manchester had significant German populations. German men worked across Britain as hotel staff, as waiters, as barbers, as musicians. They spoke English. They lived in British cities. They had British neighbours. They attended British social events. They were, in many cases, so assimilated into British urban life that their German origin was barely noticed or remarked upon. In 1914, when war was declared, many of these men found themselves interned as enemy aliens. Others returned to Germany. Some were already back in Germany on holiday when mobilization happened and could not return, and some of them ended up in German regiments on the Western Front, facing the country they had lived in, the people they had known, the streets they had walked. The Christmas truce accounts are full of this. German soldiers speaking English fluently, not the halting English of a phrasebook, but the natural English of men who had lived and worked in British cities. German soldiers who had been barbers shaving British soldiers in no man's land, because the tools were in their hands and the habit was in their fingers. German soldiers who knew specific London streets, specific Manchester pubs, specific hotels in Piccadilly. And on the other side, British soldiers discovering that the man in the opposite trench had been their neighbour, had served them in a restaurant, had shared a boarding house with them. The war had put them on opposite sides of 50 yards of mud and wire, but before the war they had been part of the same city. This pre-war connection shaped the quality of the Christmas truce in a way that I think has never been adequately understood. The truce was not simply a spontaneous outbreak of Christmas spirit overwhelming the hostility of war. It was possible in part because for a significant proportion of the men involved, particularly on the German side, the enemy was literally a known quantity, not an abstraction, not the barbarian of the propaganda posters, a man you had met, a city you had lived in, a culture you had been part of. We are Saxons, you are Anglo-Saxons. Word of a gentleman is for us as for you. The German officer who said that to the British captain was not speaking abstractly, he was invoking a shared world. Before I close, I want to give you how the relationship between German and British soldiers changed as the war went on, because the picture I have been describing is not uniform across all 4 years. What the Christmas truce of 1914 captured was something specific to the early war. A moment before the industrial killing had done its full work on the psychology of the men doing it. As the years passed, the human connection became harder to maintain, and for reasons that any honest account of the war has to acknowledge. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 changed things. The specific character of the Somme, the scale of the casualties, the weeks of bombardment, the industrial efficiency of the killing, produced in both German and British soldiers a quality of experience that made the Christmas truce of 1914 feel like something from a different war, fought by different men in a different world. Men who had shaken hands in no man's land in December 1914 were by July 1916 fighting with a desperation and a ferocity that had been built by 2 years of accumulating loss. This tacit system of mutual restraint survived in quiet sectors throughout the war, but it became more fragile, more contested, more dependent on the specific character of the men in a specific sector, at a specific moment. The Somme also produced something in German soldiers that the early war accounts do not contain, a specific exhaustion and desperation that German letters and diaries from 1916 and 1917 describe in ways that would not have been out of place in British accounts. The image of the German army as an efficient, well-supplied machine grinding down the British attackers is one that the German soldiers themselves did not recognise. The German accounts of the Somme describe men who were frightened, hungry, undersupplied, psychologically broken by the artillery, unable to rotate through the line fast enough to rest. The British prisoners who told German interrogators they still believed in victory were not simply loyal or optimistic. They were, from the German perspective, describing something the German soldiers were beginning to doubt about their own side. By 1917 and 1918, the specific quality of mutual professional respect that Junger had described, the refusal to hate the enemy, the recognition of shared soldierly experience, was under severe pressure from the accumulated weight of what both sides had done to each other. The gas attacks, the raids with no prisoners taken, the bombardments that lasted weeks and left men unable to function. The informal system was real and documented, but it coexisted with episodes of specific savagery that the same accounts also document without softening. This was a war. Both things were true simultaneously. The man who shook hands with a German soldier in December 1914 and the man who killed a wounded German prisoner in July 1916 were sometimes the same man, and the distance between those two acts was the specific distance that the war had created in him. I want to close with the thing that I find most striking about the whole picture, because I think it is the thing that the standard history most completely fails to convey. The German soldiers' attitude to the British was not uniform. It was not simply respect, or simply fear, or simply human connection. It was all of those things at once, in different proportions at different times, shaped by which part of Germany a man came from, which sector of the front he was in, which specific British regiment was facing him, what stage of the war it was, and what had happened to him personally in the weeks and months before. A Prussian officer in 1916 had a completely different relationship to the British than a Saxon farmer in 1914. A German soldier who had lived in London had a completely different relationship to the British than one who had never left Bavaria. A man who had been through the Somme had a completely different relationship to everything than a man who had been in a quiet sector. What the German documents show, the intelligence reports, the diaries, the memoirs, the letters home, is that the German soldier of the First World War was not the efficient machine of British cultural memory any more than the British soldier was the hapless victim of incompetent commanders. He was a human being in a situation that exceeded his ability to control, facing another human being in the same situation, and making of that encounter whatever his specific history and character and the specific moment allowed. Ernst Junger put it better than I can in the sentence that I have come back to more than any other in the research for this video. It is exactly in this that I have found many kindred souls among British officers. He was talking about the refusal to hate the enemy. He was talking about the capacity to face someone across no man's land and see a man rather than an abstraction. He found that capacity in the British officers he faced. He believed they found it in him. The ladies from hell, the Saxons who floated messages in bottles, the German barber shaving a British soldier in no man's land, the intelligence officer noting that every British prisoner still believed Britain would win, the cheer that went up along the German line when the British guns finally stopped. That is what they really thought. It is more complicated than either side's history has wanted to admit, and it is, in the end, more human than anything the official narratives of either country produced.